The Master 175 combination lock. Let me first say that this is not a video on how to bypass. This is to show how to retrieve the combination once you have forgotten it. Okay, this is the decoding tool. It's made from a feeler gauge with a thickness of 0.002. And you can see right here on the very tip there is a slight bend to it. You will need to make that bend later on. I'll show you how. First step is take your feeler gauge and with a pair of scissors you're going to make a cut similar to this all the way up to that hole. After you've made that cut, you want to cut straight across to the outside edge and remove this piece completely. The next step is to cut this to the width necessary. Using your 175, kind of eyeball it, and you want it as thick as the casing of the lock. So come to the outside and trim just a little, like so. It's still just a tad too wide, so we'll trim a little bit more. Looks good. Now then, in between these numbers you have these little spaces. The length of the feeler gauge is used to measure it from there. You want to go from the outside of the lock casing to the first space. So we need to trim off whatever's holding over the edge of the casing. As such. Still just a little bit too long. We'll trim a little more off. See how that works. After you've cut your feeler gauge or decoder tool to length and width, you'll need to take a pair of tweezers or something small, and with the markings of 0.002 on top, get to the very edge of your gauge and you're going to bend it up. It doesn't take much, but it does have to have that bend. It's kind of hard to see, but it's there. So you want it bending up in the direction of the labeling itself. Okay, now we're going to retrieve the combination from the Master 175. The first step over here is where you place the key at for changing your combination when the lock is open. We are going to start at the far end. Place your dial so that instead of it being zeros all the way across, it's 0.5 or just a half turn. When decoding this lock, you will be using half turns for each one. That little bend that I was discussing earlier, that should be facing straight down at this point. Sometimes you need to pull the wheel aside. Stick it down in the slot, stand it up, and slide back and forth. You're feeling for a little slot or a little hole. If it's not there, turn again. Again, only half steps in between the numbers and feel for that slot. When you feel that slot, there'll be very little movement back and forth. When you find that slot, go to the next number up. This was 1.5. We're going to go to 2. Then you add 2. 1, 2. That'll be your first number of the combination. You do that for all three. Always stand to the right side of each wheel. Okay, now I'm going to show you what's going on inside the lock when you're using the feeler gauge. Remember the edge that I told you to bend? Right here on each wheel, there's a little ledge. When you put the feeler gauge in and that little bent actually goes down and hits that ledge, it pushes the feeler gauge away from the wheel just enough to get it down into the slots that I was talking about earlier, from here to here. If you'll notice, the center of that slot is in line with the space between two numbers. What you're wanting to do is take your feeler gauge decoder and get it down into that slot, and you know you've got the right slot when you can only move it back and forth a little bit, like so. Then you know you've got the right one. You know if you're catching the flat side, if it'll only go one so far, and the furthest side is at the edge of the center here. Again, in the middle, you're feeling for that.